going to be a quick chat regarding Asia 2030. So the infinite growth imperative. Before I jump on to a few questions, I would like Aaron to give an opening remarks on the topic.
No, thanks Sachin for having me this morning. To be honest, the infinite growth imperative for us is quite straightforward in the sense that as a startup itself, we honestly have to grow indefinitely, right? Not only just infinitely in that sense. So I thought this morning's sessions was quite interesting, and as you know how AI actually impacts all industries, not just our industry specifically. I actually feel that this topic today cannot be more apt in that sense. And just following up on one of your statements that you made about the government being behind all these AI initiatives and stuff like that. Just yesterday during the budget exercise, the Singapore government has also announced something similar, right? So the Singapore government, our PM Lawrence Wong just announced yesterday the setup of the National AI Council, right? So I think that, and by the way, the PM himself is chairing this particular council, and that goes to show how much Singapore believes that AI is going to shape all industries itself, jobs of the futures, education and stuff like that. And I think this is a very, very strong endorsement, and for that matter, a very strong wake-up call for all of us here, be in Asia or be it outside of Asia in that sense, right? About the importance of AI and the importance of us trying to grow, be it the enterprises, the businesses, the government, right, across the world globally.
So give us a sense, how you seeing Asia, for decades we've seen the Western world actually dominating the innovation scene. So how, with your lenses across the Asia, how do you think Asia is becoming a global innovation engine? And what, across governments, across the ecosystem, what's working for us?
There's a lot that's going on right now, right? And I think there are some pros and cons in some sense. And if you look at the Western world itself, and when I think about Western world, I think sometimes about legacy systems, right? Like the SWIFT network, for instance, is one such example. If you think about Europe, if you think about SWIFT payments, if some of you are aware of that, that's just traditionally how transfers of monies are made, cross-border. But if you look closer to Asia in this case, and I would just like to draw, like say, for instance, like WeChat's payment wallet, right? The QR code payment system that they popularized more than a decade ago. Today, if you go to, by the way, I just came back from China just to attend this Entrepreneurs, Summit. But, when I was there, you cannot help but just be at awe about the efficiency of the whole payment systems that we have in China, right? And for that matter, even in India, right, with all the what's that, the unified payments, what's that called?
Unified payment
unified payment gateway, right, across India itself and things like that. And so, sometimes while I think that there's a lot of innovation definitely coming from the United States, there's also increasingly even more innovation that is driven by the fact that actually we did not have this particular legacy system that that would probably be harder for the Westerners, the Americans to adopt, or for that matter, the Europeans, right? So I think that's one big overarching thing. And if you also look about the fact that for us, for a lot of Southeast Asia, or even Asia itself, be it in India, be it in China, or most parts of Southeast Asia, we have not actually went through this whole PC era, right? So if you think about Dell, right? If you think about even Microsoft and stuff, they're really very old school desktop related companies. But for the bulk of Asia itself, honestly, we leapfrog this whole thing, right? So there is no PC in that sense, or rather a lot of them don't really use that, and it's a lot more mobile. And this has impacted even our own businesses itself, right? Look at us as a company. We actually didn't manage to use traditional CRMs, right? In the past, I always remember when I first met my first set of investors, they asked me, why do you bother building your own CRM? Why do you bother doing this, doing that, and stuff like that? To which I always explain, in Southeast Asia, or in Asia in general, I would say that the email doesn't work, right? So, we cannot sell a car to someone and ask them, can I get your email address? It doesn't work that way. So more often than not, customers will come and say, this is my mobile number, take it or leave it in that sense. And we have to, in that sense, adapt and innovate across the spectrum, right? So this whole mobile first thing also allowed us to not only invest doubly more than what our Western counterparts did versus the PC era, and this allows us to supercharge the growth across the region itself, right? So in that sense, having that 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 the sorry having lesser legacy systems itself and whatnot has actually helped us supercharge innovation across the region itself, and something that's I think honestly peculiar, unique to Asia versus that of the Westerners. I think oftentimes people think that we are copycats, but honestly Asia itself has already leapfrogged that in that sense, right? So we are really showing true innovation by necessity, by the fact that we are not hamstrung by legacy system, and not so much, copycats anymore.
Yeah. No, I think what you've highlighted is very true, because what we are building, one, we are not building on the legacy, right? So we've got that advantage, and also from the overall mindset, I think whether it's government, whether it's the ecosystem, whether it's the product and technology that we're building is absolutely amazing. So on from startup to unicorn, right? So scaling in Asia, you've spoken about the positives, but there are a lot of challenges in a fragmented market like where we operate. So give us a sense from the lessons, of building Carro. What are the challenges? What are the lessons you've learned
Oh,
for some fellow
yeah,
folks who are starting?
honestly, it took us many years. I couldn't claim to be an expert in this, but that said, we are in 8 geographies right now today across Asia Pacific, right? Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, Japan, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Australia more recently. And I must say that honestly, we really took a long time. But I would just default to two or three things that we always look at. Number one, systems itself, right? So for us to expand, we have to have a replicable system, and that is super important, right? And what does that mean? The system, processes, things like that. If you do not have a replicable core itself, it's very hard to extend your business itself. So that's the first thing that companies have to make sure that they have. The second thing you ask yourself is, what's your differentiation, right, as you enter the markets itself? Because for us in Asia Pacific or Asia in general, none of the markets are really that homogeneous. Every one of us are a little bit different in that sense. So when we entered Japan, we entered with a very different strategy versus when we entered Singapore. You would imagine, developed economy, same, but honestly, same but different for the bulk of it, right? So, as we entered all these markets, we always enter with that kind of approach and stuff and whatnot. So systems, and I think, I also wouldn't expand into new markets without the right people, right? So oftentimes when you see me entering a new market, the first thing I would do is I take myself out of wherever I am, or sometimes I take my CEO out wherever he is, and then we'll live in the market literally for a month or two, just to understand the market a little bit. And before we even enter the market, typically we'll be hiring from locally, right? So if I enter Japan, I'll be hiring some Japanese from Singapore or from wherever I am, just to understand a little bit better, and also to make sure that we have people entering the market, people who have been trained here and brought over, versus parachuting in that sense. I don't really believe in parachuting that much, so I always believe in training locally, and we sort of like bring the people over to respective markets. So, there's nothing concrete in that sense, but having a replicable playbook, systems, processes, super important. Making sure you understand that all the markets are different, right? So I'm sure in India it's also the same, right? It's very different entering Chennai versus entering Mumbai, right? In that sense. But yeah, so I think what's ultimately most important still is the people, and having the right people. I will never enter a new market until I sort out who is going to enter that market with me, or the right partners.
You make it look very easy and simple, but I know, operating businesses across markets could be very difficult. So you've been a CEO, you've been a technology engineer, you've been a researcher yourself, and what are key one point very quickly in terms of decision making or leadership when you say that you operate differently in Japan or Singapore? Give us one odd example that would have changed or made a difference in terms of decision making.
Well, in terms of decision making itself, whenever I'm a programmer by training, right? So everything I think we think about life on a first principles basis, system design standpoint in that sense, and I tend to simplify things a lot, right? So when we enter a market, from a programmer standpoint, we always believe in modularization, right? So we start by building module A, module B, module C. And of course, everything works together in tandem, and that's the systems itself, to then deliver the product in that sense. And there's no difference when I enter a new market, right? When I enter a new market, there's almost like a Gantt chart that I have, right? It tells me, okay, this is what I need to do in order for me to get into the new market, right? And so that's the exact same thing I would do, right? So if there's only one thing I would say is that probably serves me the best, right, in that sense, which is having a step-by-step approach, number one. Number two, more importantly, split up every single task into measurable, very clear KPI, input, output kind of stuff, and then stitch everything up back together at the end of the day, right? So, more systems design thinking. I think that's how, I tend to make my decision as we move along, entering each of these markets, be it in Japan, be it in Hong Kong, Taiwan, and stuff like that. It's always the same theory, right, which is divide and conquer, right? Modularize your approach and, try to be systematic in the way that you think as you enter the market.
So I also wear a different hat back home in India, wherein I deal with a lot of SMEs, traditional businesses, right? And there's been a bit of a ongoing debate about what AI would do to them, right? And while there's a lot being written and spoken about, but in a practical sense, being at a helm of affairs, where do you see 5 years these traditional industries, how they'll be impacted with AI?
I think all industries will be impacted. Many, some will be extinct, right? I think in that sense. So I do generally feel that maybe India, maybe parts of Southeast Asia, like Indonesia, Thailand, the impact of AI on I'm talking like say restaurants and stuff like that, right? I think that will be far lesser versus that of like say for instance jobs that requires pattern recognition, right? Like doctors, right? Jobs that requires sieving through lots and lots of text, like lawyers. Jobs that requires you to, code using certain languages, like programmers. I think those will be severely impacted. So going back to your question about traditional industries, depend on what you mean by traditional. Because to be honest, I look at, lawyers as traditional jobs, doctors as traditional jobs, even increasingly programmers as traditional jobs, right? So all these things, all said and done, I think the impact of AI specifically will be across the board, not just for the really, really traditional jobs. Personally, I think the SMEs are more or less okay, right? They are not, unless you're playing in those fields, as I said, like pattern recognition, tax and stuff like that. But in general, if you are, trading labor for something like, in this case, restaurants, opening up, I don't know, like a buffet line and stuff like that, you are generally fine. There isn't too much to talk about when it comes towards AI and disruption in these traditional sectors, but it's definitely on these knowledge sectors that has been, one of the many things that I feel that is going to be very interesting is with more and more of this AI, edge computing and stuff like that, really there is no need for drivers, right? So self-driving cars and stuff like that will definitely come. It's just a matter of time, assuming regulations go through.
Interesting. So you've got a very elite set of investors, SoftBank, Temasek, and Singapore is leading the sustainability piece as well. So how do you balance, in a practical sense with such investors, how do you balance ambitious growth versus sustainable execution?
It depends on when you ask me this question. If you ask me this question 6 years ago during COVID itself, the answer is only growth. If you ask me this question 2 years ago, 3 years ago, when the interest rates rose and the market sort of tanked, I would say the answer is EBITDA. You go for EBITDA. You forget about growth. If you ask me this question 2 months ago, I would say that I think it's both, right, in some sense. And so what happened is I just came back from the United States. I went there for what we call NDR, non-deal roadshow. And then when I was in the US, I think what's very clear to me just 2 months ago, growth is back in fashion, right? So when I met all these institutional funds, all these government funds in the United States and elsewhere, they always tell me, say that, you know what, you should consider trading off some EBITDA for growth, like much higher growth in that sense. And I think today, the answer for that question is that it depends and it morphs with time, really, right? It's hard to put a finger to where it is right now, but right now, I would dare say that it's growth and EBITDA, but I would say 70-30 versus like, in the past, like all growth, all EBITDA kind of stuff, right? So I think that is the case in that sense. All these investors, the good thing that we have going for us is that they have been very supportive across the company, across the life cycle. And, hopefully as we try to go public as a company itself that, we will continue to see the same support with a different set of investors in that sense.
Interesting. So one thing that we always speak about when we talk about growth capital is talent. Give me a perspective on how Asia is able to attract. I mean, I'm talking more from a broader sense point, but you can give me some specifics in terms of markets that you work in. In terms of attracting global talent, are we able to nurture talent locally, or what's your perspective on that?
So, if the question is attracting global talent, I think is tough, right? Because, to be honest, okay, it depends on how you look at things, but to be honest, it's very hard to compete against Meta, Google, Spotify. The reason why Spotify's name is here is because Spotify took many of my engineers, right? So it wasn't easy to fight all these guys off because they have literally unlimited war chests, right? So they can pay to nobody's end. Of course, there are some people who still choose to come to Asia to work, right? It'll be in Grab, be it in us or anybody else, simply because their family is here. But don't forget, even that Meta, your Twilio, your Google, whatever not, they all have offices in Asia. In India, I'm sure there's a lot, right? It's definitely in Singapore they have too. And so that makes attracting talent, foreign, really, I'm talking about top tier AI talent, top tier programmers, top tier whatever, into Asia, honestly not so easy. To which then I prefer to default to nurturing, right? So to answer your question, Sachin, really for us internally in Carro, it's really about nurturing the next generation of leaders in ourselves, right? So we start really early. Internally we have things like MA programs, management associate, management trainees, and literally we bring them, we rotate them across the business lines, across the countries itself, so that we start nurturing them from young, in that sense. And in my company, we have many people that has been in the company for sounds like a decade, but really it's about 7, 8, 9, 10 years. And that really makes a big difference, right? Because you start training them up, they know exactly what's going on with the businesses itself, and it helps. So I prefer to nurture, retain, than I prefer to attract, in that sense, because I fundamentally don't believe that we have that kind of attraction versus that of a Meta or Google, right? Yeah.
That was very candid and honest answer. While we are talking about Asia 2030, I mean, and it's been a very dynamic, and you've given us a perspective how things are changing and how your organization itself has been looking for growth, EBITDA, and now growth in some sense again. So if somebody was to probably look at 2030, if you have to give me a perspective, which startups do you think would be growing, and who would be struggling from a cultural change that you're seeing in the market?
I think AI will be set left, right, center on this, right? So one thing for sure is that I feel startups or companies that actually adopt systems design thinking. Internally a lot in the company, we don't talk a lot about using of AI. It's not like using ChatGPT itself means that you are an AI-enabled company in that sense. A lot of us is more like business process re-engineering or business process engineering, and that's typically what we focus a lot of our time and attention on these days in the company. And what does that mean? That means looking at an old process, looking at an old whatever, right, a module or things like that, and we ask ourselves, how can this be done differently? How can this be done better with AI in that sense? And I think whoever that survives in this coming years ahead, really, number one, you really have to embrace this whole idea of business process re-engineering, whereby it's not so much about just using AI or using AI as part of your modules or systems and stuff and whatnot, or workflow, but really it's about redesigning, fundamentally rethinking the systems itself to adapt for today's time and age. AI is not just a plugin, right? Really, is more all-encompassing than that. And if you couple that together with agentic AI and stuff like that, it can really transform industry. So in short, I would say that companies that can harness AI, and I use the word harness, not exactly just implementing AI or using ChatGPT in that sense. And I have to say also that AI is way more than just LLMs, right? It's not just large language models. AI, there's computer vision, there's sound, there's all kinds of things in AI as we look into it, and it's not just simplistically, text. There's multi-model in that sense. But whoever that adopts AI will be able to and for that matter, can harness its impact, redesign traditional industries and stuff like that. Those will be the survivors. And for that matter, those that cannot adapt, right, will probably be the one that is out of business and stuff like that moving forward.
So what you're saying is from a mindset, adaptability and flexibility would probably lead the way. Excellent. Do you still code? I mean, do you get time to code?
Yeah, I code a lot. I just coded last night. Yeah.
Oh, excellent. So that's all I have for you in questions, but we'll probably take one or two questions from the audience. That's all time we have right now. Any questions for Aaron? Okay, maybe offline, Aaron. Any closing remarks you have before we
No,
close this?
I think thanks for having me today. It was really incredible. I mean, hopefully we'll see more of entrepreneur in this part of the world in Singapore. I'm very excited about this. Everything that we can do to help really promote the entrepreneurship, or for that matter, making the whole ecosystem more vibrant is always good, right? So thanks for having us today.
Thank you for joining us, and